you're someone who already squats with a low bar and you want to make it even better, or you're someone who high bar squats and you want to transition to the low bar, well, in this video, I want to explain 3 of the key areas that you need to consider so you get left with nothing other than all of the tools you actually need to make your low bar squat something worth talking about. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the bar placement. Now, a typical high bar squat would have the bar sitting a little bit higher than the low bar, and it finds itself resting on the traps just below the crease of your neck. The low bar placement, however, finds itself a little bit lower, and most people typically suggest that it sits in the so-called shelf that the rear delts will create when you shorten the muscle by bringing the elbows back and slightly upwards. Now, in reality, you should actually feel free to manipulate that position of the bar, either higher or lower, depending on what's going to feel most comfortable for you. Now, in these two comparisons, you can actually see that the low bar placement actually covers a larger surface area on the body compared to a high bar placement. And as a result of that, it tends to feel much more stable and much more secure than a high bar position. And when I say it feels secure, basically it just feels like it wobbles a little bit less when the bar is actually on your shoulders. And as a result of that, you just get a little bit more increase in confidence when the bar is actually sitting on your shoulders. Now, hand position on the barbell is the bane of most low bar squatters' existence, purely because it can be painful to begin with, but I'll give you a simple trick at the end of this video to make sure that that doesn't actually happen to you. Just like the bar placement where there's no one-size-fits-all approach, the hand position you adopt on the bar is going to be dependent on individual comfort. The thing that we want to understand with hand placement is that where we place our hands can either positively or negatively contribute to upper back tightness, and how much of that shelf you can create with the rear delts. The wider you have your hands, the less jammed up it might feel at the shoulder and the elbow, but you're also going to limit the upper back tightness. The closer you have your hands, on the other hand, the upper back is going to feel much tighter and secure, but a closer hand placement for some people might actually have them raising their elbows a little bit too high. That can then start to make them feel like they're tipping forwards when they're squatting because it naturally forces the upper back to arch, which ends up with the weight shifting forwards. And then we start to notice more pressure underneath the forefoot compared to the ideal midfoot pressure that I'll be talking about in a minute. So play with the hand position just like you play with the bar position. At first, you might need to start a little bit wider, but as you build confidence with the squat over time, you should look to bring them in a little bit closer to the point where you feel tight and it doesn't result in you arching the back and tipping forwards when you're actually doing the squat. Now, the next thing I need you to pay attention to is going to be what you do with your feet. Now, foot placement is predicated on the idea that as you squat, the bar wants to remain vertical and directly over your midfoot, like I mentioned a moment ago. Because of the lower bar placement, you'll naturally find yourself with more torso lean than you would in, say, for example, the high bar squat. And that's actually what we want. But that's only going to happen if you let your feet find a position where you can move the hips back before you descend to get more forward torso lean so that the bar remains vertical and directly over your midfoot. That means that you have to adjust your feet, and generally it's going to be a little bit wider than what you would have them if you were to do a high bar squat. So like the bar placement and the hand placement, you're going to have to play with the foot placement until you find what works and what's comfortable. As you can see in this video right here, if I were to adopt a low bar position without actually changing my feet and keeping the same as if it were in a high bar position, the bar is naturally going to want to travel forwards and end up over my forefoot. Whereas if I widen my stance, I'm able to keep the bar path vertical and over my midfoot. I like to say to clients that I work with that it should almost start to feel like a standing leg press, where you feel really powerful and not limited by the feeling that you're going to fall forwards or backwards. So if you do notice the weight shifting in either direction, manipulate your foot position. And lastly, there are some things that you should actually expect from a low bar squat. These things can actually sometimes deter people from using the low bar squat, or they struggle to become friends with it. The low bar squat is an unforgiving exercise where it allows you to move far more weight than a high bar, but it comes at the expense of initial discomfort, which I promise you will be subdued as you do more of it and become better at it. One of the most common complaints is that it actually starts to hurt the wrists. Because of the lower bar placement, the wrist finds itself in a higher degree of extension compared to the high bar squat. The easiest fix is to wear wrist wraps like you would in a bench press, and you can even wrap the wrists a little bit higher than you would when you use them for the bench press. The shoulders and the elbows are then another area that tend to cause a lot of people grief, and with regular exposure, that discomfort too will dissipate. And the easiest way to manage that is with some smarter programming approaches. I'd recommend that you limit low bar squats to once per week with a lower volume approach, especially when you're starting out. As you become more accustomed to the exercise and you feel like you're ready to push a little bit further, add a secondary exposure later in the week, but keep the volume even lower on the second day whilst increasing it ever so slightly on the main day. There's no need to low bar squat more than twice a week, even if you want to become better at it. Rather, use the high bar or the safety bar for any additional squat exposures. Now, to learn more about the safety bar, you can check out this video by Aiden where he explains the benefits and the utility of the safety bar. The next thing to expect is going to be that you might run into some discomfort at the hips. Now, this is a very, very important one, and it almost happens with absolutely everyone. And it's primarily going to be caused by the adductors. Now, the adductors play a pivotal role in stabilizing the hip at the bottom of the squat when you're in the hole. As you start the ascent, the adductors pull the knees inwards, and this is the natural mechanism that occurs so that your foot can begin to pronate and for you to apply force into the ground. The adductors also contribute to hip extension at the top of the leg. So there's a bit going on with the adductors, and they need to be closely managed. Now, the adductors originate on the pelvic bones and they insert on the femur, the leg bone. So you can imagine a wider foot placement by default would have the adductors in a more lengthened position to begin with, placing more demand on them. The same thing happens when people start sumo deadlifting. They feel like their adductors want to rip off the bones and their hips are just going to explode. Now, the last thing, and arguably the most important thing that I need you to consider, is that you need to expect your squat numbers to absolutely skyrocket when you start low bar squatting. If you'd like some guidance on how you can program the low bar squat and make the most of it, just find me on Instagram where I provide a ton of valuable information for all lifters, and just shoot me a DM. Let me know that you watched the video and hit me with any of the questions that you might have and want a little bit more elaboration on.